Hi, welcome to our first lecture of our final week of class. And our topic today is American immigration in 3 acts. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we're going to look at 3 specific laws throughout American history that have really shaped and reshaped immigration patterns in different times in American history. So specifically, we're going to start with just some contemporary kind of look at immigration issues. What is immigration? Why do people immigrate? That kind of stuff. And then we're going to look at the first major piece of immigration legislation in American history, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as a law that was passed that same year. So basically, as we're going to learn for a long time, the United States did not have comprehensive immigration legislation until about the kind of the mid 1800s. So we're going to look at that. And then Act 2 is we're going to look at the Immigration Act of 1924, which is a very consequential act that shaped immigration for several decades until the 1960s happened. And immigration policy in the United States was completely transformed in ways that have led us to the America that we have today. And we're going to look at this issue of the browning of America. So if you don't know what that term is, just hold tight and you will. And then finally, we're going to end by looking at another contemporary issue, which is the U.S.-Mexico border. Obviously, a very hot topic, an issue that a lot of Americans feel very strongly about in either direction. And I think what I want you to do is just kind of reflect on this and maybe develop some ideas and opinions on this very, 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 very complex issue. And again, I don't care what your politics are, the U.S.-Mexican border is an insanely complex issue that I think is not easily boiled down to one thing. So I think it's good to spend some time kind of thinking and talking about it. And that's how we're going to end out the day. So let's begin again with Immigration 101. So unless you've been, completely off of social media and are not paying attention to any news issues in American society right now, and by the way, if you are doing that, I envy you. You know that immigration is one of the many issues that Americans tend to divide over, politically speaking, right? Generally speaking, people on the left are more kind of pro-immigration, and people on the right tend to be less so. Here is some data to back that up. So as you see here, this is a Gallup poll. This is relatively recent. It came out within the past year. You see that generally speaking, Republicans tend to think that immigration to the United States should be decreased, whereas liberals, Democrats, right, tend to think the opposite. And here is another piece of data. So this was the one on the left is kind of more general survey. The one on the right was a little more specific. And it was basically asking people this question. Look at the italicized part. Which of the following statements is closer to your opinion about what kind of country you think the United States should be? A country with an essential American culture and values that immigrants take on when they arrive, or a country made up of many cultures and values that change as new people arrive? And again, this is a great question because I think this really is at the heart of immigration, right? At the heart of the immigration question and controversy is the question of like, what is America and what do we want America to be, right? Again, what is an American? So that's when we're talking about it. Okay, so anyway, here's the results of that. Just kind of average together, generally prefer an essential American culture, right? So a majority of Americans believe that that is what America should be. However, it gets a little more interesting and I think specific when you break it down by political affiliation. Overwhelmingly, people who want to prefer or preserve an essential American culture tend to be conservative, and people who feel the opposite tend to be liberal, right? So again, being a dead horse, talking about this issue over and over again, but pretty much everything, every issue in American society tends to break down in these kind of polarized camps. But even so, I mean, you can see there's a lot of people in every camp that disagree. Now, these disagreements in immigration have really, really, really shaped our national politics in particular over the past few kind of national election cycles, right? So, for example, Donald Trump, when he won the 2016 election, there are a lot of reasons why he won the 2016 election, but polling both before and after revealed that for a huge majority of Americans who voted for Donald Trump did so because of his views on immigration, right? And of course, his promise to build a border wall, kind of from sea to sea across the U.S.-Mexico border, some of which has already been built, as you can see here, was one of the reasons why a lot of people who supported him did so. Now, obviously, the border wall is trying to address the issue of undocumented immigration across the southern border. However, the Trump administration, really early on in his tenure as president, his administration really focused on not just kind of illegal or undocumented immigration, but legal immigration as well, right? Very early on in Trump's presidency, his administration announced that they were going to be reducing immigration from kind of majority Muslim countries. Now, it is illegal to do that, right? You cannot say the United States is going to restrict immigration from certain countries because of their religious beliefs. Did was basically reword it and kind of target the same countries that they originally targeted, but did so for kind of political reasons, right? Reducing terrorism and things like that. The Trump administration was able to achieve their goal of reducing legal immigration from countries that people within the administration and just people who voted for Trump in general saw as kind of undesirable and not wanted in the United States.
5 years ago, then President Donald Trump signed an executive order that banned people from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the U.S. for 90 days. Reaction to the move was swift. Protests broke out at airports around the U.S. and in support of the Muslim community. Lawsuits were also filed in attempts to block the ban. While there's now a new administration in the White House and the order is no longer in place, many people are still feeling its impacts. For more on this, I'm joined by Ruwaida Abdelaziz. She's an investigative reporter for HuffPost. First of all, thank you for joining us, Ruwaida. You just recently completed, and I was reading some of your reports, a year-long investigation on how the travel ban impacted families, and it's still impacting families and individuals. What have been some of those long-lasting effects, according to your reporting?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, absolutely that. 5 years later, families are still feeling the consequences of that one policy. Over the last year, I've collected about 900 cases and examples of those impacts. Almost all of them involve some sort of family separation, including parents being split apart from their children and partners also being split up. In more than 100 of our cases, people reported some sort of medical hardship. In about a third of our data, the person impacted faced some sort of more than one extreme hardship, So this could have been a death in the family and an economic loss, et cetera. So the analysis really is the first of its kind in terms of providing us with just a glimpse into the physical, economic, and mental toll of the ban and those that it's impacted. But behind those numbers, there are thousands of more stories. People who've lost loved ones, milestones that were missed, like birthdays, weddings, and funerals. Some people have given up entirely on trying to immigrate to the U.S., while others have left the U.S. to reunite with their families in third countries. Others have been trapped in war zones, missed opportunities like jobs and schoolings. People have had to forfeit those. And so some of the impacts of this ban is simply unquantifiable.
It was really gut-wrenching to read some of those accounts in your reporting. You documented nearly 900 stories. Is there one or several that really stuck with you?
There are so many. I think of the main character in my investigation, Mohammed Saleh, who lost his son, a father who couldn't bring his 20-year-old son to the U.S., who was diagnosed with a heart condition for treatment because of the ban. And by the time his application was going through the process, it was a little too late. He passed in May 2021. I think about Layla, who's an incredibly bright woman from Iran who won the diversity visa, also known as the lottery, who was ready to come into the U.S. and contributed her skill sets. She has a master's degree in biomedical engineering, and that opportunity was also taken away from her, and she is unlikely to win that diversity visa again. And there are so many others.
Obviously, this caused a lot of furor then and now. And regardless of your views on this, the point is immigration is a really big issue in American society today.
Now, before fully jumping into the topic of immigration, I want to pull up some of our survey data. Just to get a sense of where some of us are from and just how kind of life outside the United States has shaped our experience in the United States. The first question I want to look at is this one: what languages do you speak and write in fluently or semi-fluently? So here we have, let me zoom in. Here we have Arabic, Chinese, English, obviously, French or Creole, German, Japanese, Korean, Spanish, Tagalog, Vietnamese, Yoruba. I used to be good with Spanish. I was a write-in. We have somebody who speaks 4 different Southeast Asian languages. Wow. Turkish, Jamaican Patois, Igbo, and Lingala. We come from all over the place, right? And I know many of us in this class are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. So in that way, I think we reflect the kind of immigration history of this country. I want to look at one more survey question. This question said, immigration, both legal and illegal, is a huge issue that many Americans disagree about. Below are a series of statements representing a variety of opinions on immigration. Pick one or more that best capture your views. And again, pick one or more means it's not going to add up to 100%. Most of you agree with this statement. Immigration makes our nation stronger and more diverse. About half of you agree with this statement. The U.S. is a nation of immigrants, and I see resistance to immigration as un-American. And the third most popular answer, I have family members and or friends who are immigrants, and some people's hostility towards immigrants concerns me, right? So I think a majority of this class kind of agrees that like immigration is good. Let's look at some of the other opinions. Two of you said this: I was not born here, and some people's hostility towards immigrants makes me feel attacked. Two of you also said illegal immigration and border security is a huge problem that isn't being properly addressed. And then basically from here on out, we have kind of individual opinions. Immigration is good in theory, but right now the U.S. is allowing too many potentially threatening people in. I immigrated here legally and am frustrated with the notions legal immigrants deal with, as well as the handling of illegal immigrants by the government. Okay, so this person is kind of frustrated in all directions. These are all write-in responses, by the way. United States after going through a legal visa process, but think there are many people who want to come to the United States illegally. Without immigrants, America would be nothing. Who does the dirty work? Immigrants. That's true. I came here legally, but I understand the United States needs a system of immigration. However, I don't hate people who come illegally because I know some are trying to escape immediate danger. I have family members and friends who are immigrants, but I still think that everybody who comes to the U.S. should be verified to make sure there are no people with harmful intentions coming. This is a long one, but it's thoughtful, so I'm going to read the whole thing. I feel like immigration is a plea to live in the sense that nobody is immigrating to the U.S. just because America has its problems as well. Hence, no one is just fond of it, whereas it is a situation where people are running for their lives and trying to survive. Therefore, America is the closest thing to freedom. A very impassioned view there. And then lastly, I think that defining a person as illegal is harmful and is intentionally used to perpetuate negative beliefs about immigrants and refugees. Passionate opinions here. So again, thank you for your being honest. And I really hope today's lecture will provide a little more context into why we have so many opinions on immigration in America.
And that leads us to our big idea, which is this. America has a complicated record on immigration, right? Back to this whole freedoms and fault lines thing. On one hand, we have historically welcomed more immigrants than any other nation. Again, that's just factually true. Now, whether you might disagree with the word welcome, maybe you're an immigrant and don't feel welcome all the time, and that's fine. But just in terms of sheer numbers, the United States just has more immigrants than any nation on the entire history of the planet. On the other hand, anti-immigrant sentiments have always shaped immigration policies. So again, regardless of your views and opinions on this, whether you're kind of pro-immigrant or whether you think we need less immigration, whether you're kind of somewhere in between and kind of have more of a mixed and nuanced, complicated view on this. This has been our history, right? We're a nation of immigrants. That's also a nation that's hated immigrants, which, this is just classic American contradictory attitudes that we're going to unpack a little bit historically and try to understand kind of the broad story of immigration in this country. Now, again, emphasis on broad. If you're really interested in this topic, what I'm going to do today is not going to really kind of satiate your interest, because this is a huge topic that we could have an entire class about it. But at the very least, I think it's good to have some general knowledge of the story of immigration in the United States, which is what we're going to be doing today. So I want to start with this question. And again, maybe it's an obvious question. Maybe you already know the answer, or the answers, I should say. But let's start with, why do some people leave their home countries? There are lots of reasons, and here are at least two of them. Generally speaking, historians answer this question by highlighting a kind of push-pull dynamic, right? So in other words, people who leave their countries are often pushed by something and or pulled by something. So maybe it's kind of obvious, but I think the first thing we need to realize is that just if people are leaving their home countries, there's usually some kind of horror or persecution or just bad circumstance that they're trying to escape, right? On the other hand, you have kind of a pulling dynamic, right? Some are pulled by new freedoms, opportunities, and protections. I think most people who emigrate from one country to another are leaving for a combination of the two, right? There are negative factors that are pushing them, and then positive factors that are kind of enticing or pulling them. Immigration story is different and unique. What's your story? Weird question, right? Well, maybe not, because in this class, one of my goals is to connect these big issues to our own personal lives. And I'm going to ask you to do that right now. So post a reflection to the Lino board detailing how immigration has shaped your family's history. Now, maybe your family's immigration history, maybe you don't. I mean, if you're a recent immigrant, if you were born in another country, or if your parents were born in another country, this is going to be pretty simple for you. So maybe just share some brief overview what is your personal families, or you as a personal individual, your immigration story. If you're like me and have been here, your parents have kind of been here for generations and generations, that might be a little more difficult. But I'm kind of hoping and or assuming that each of us has at least a broad understanding of kind of the generational history of our family. And at some point, unless you are 100% Native American, which I don't think anyone in this class is. Conversely, if you're a person of African descent and your ancestors were enslaved, right, obviously you weren't immigrating here in the same senses that other people immigrated here. Regardless, I think everyone watching this video has immigration somewhere in their history, right? Either immediately in their own personal lives, or their family's lives, or their great, 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 whatever grandparents' lives as well. So maybe just spend a few minutes reflecting on that and just write a few sentences, just giving me a broad overview of how immigration has shaped your story. Okay, let's keep going, and we're going to get now into just some basic vocabulary, some vocabulary that's going to become relevant in various parts of today's lecture. So let's start with the concept of naturalization. So naturalization is the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. Folks born here are automatically naturalized. Obviously, if you were not born here, naturalization is like a legal and a political process you go through. There's often like a test you have to take and a series of kind of hoops you have to jump through. But if you're born here, you're automatically a U.S. citizen, which, as we're going to find out, is kind of controversial in today's political climate. So let's kind of look at naturalization. And I think specifically, as we often do, I want to look at the founding documents and examine some of the ways that some things that some ideas, I guess, that were spelled out in the founding are still shaping this debate today. The Constitution doesn't actually say a whole lot about immigration or how one becomes a citizen or anything. And this is pretty much it, actually. This comes from the section of the Constitution that's talking about the powers in the office of the presidency. And it says this: no person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president. Now, again, it's important to understand that this clause is not spelling out how one becomes a U.S. citizen. It's just kind of assuming that there is a process of becoming a U.S. citizen. So, right. So, long story short, the Constitution doesn't really spell it out, other than just assuming that there is such a person as a U.S. citizen, right? Which it's acknowledging is kind of a new idea because they're adopting this Constitution. And before we had the Articles of Confederation, where all these like different states trying to do their own thing. Now we're becoming a united nation, a United States of America, right? And there is right off the bat this assumption that if you're part of the United States of America, you are a U.S. citizen. And that's it. That's literally all the Constitution says about citizenship. So Congress, right, in the years after ratification, passed a series of laws. We're just going to look at one briefly that kind of clarified this a little bit. So in the Naturalization Act of 1790, it said this: being enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that any alien, means person from another country, right, being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof on application. There's some other things as well. So if you wanted to read it, there's kind of like a process you have to go through, as there is today. However, right off the bat, this whole WASPism, white supremacy thing, as it always does, unfortunately, rears its ugly head. And they're right off the bat, the first major citizenship law that Congress passes a few years after ratification, basically saying that only white people could be considered citizens. Now, in the decades after this, right, kind of running up to the Civil War, various northern states started abolishing slavery and started granting citizenship rights to Black people. But it really was, like a lot of things, kind of on a state-by-state basis. That changes after the Civil War. After the Civil War, obviously the North wins, the South is defeated, and Congress passes a series of constitutional amendments to try to extend citizenship rights to Black people in the South in particular, because again, most Black people in the North had enjoyed citizenship rights for a while. So what we get out of that is the 14th Amendment, which says this: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So basically, after the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1866, if you're born in the United States, you are a United States citizen. Now, again, just to, this is 2 centuries ago. This has been the law of the land since 1866. However, today, just again to connect, stuff happening a long time ago to stuff happening today, there are some people who are saying that this is actually like a loophole that's encouraging illegal immigration, right? So, for example, Ron DeSantis, one of the contenders for the 2024 Republican nomination for who will be put forward as their presidential candidate. Both DeSantis and Trump, as well as some of the other contenders for that spot, have basically said that we should end this.
The United States is among the only countries in the world that says that even if neither parent is a citizen nor even lawfully in the country, their future children are automatic citizens the moment the parents trespass onto our soil. As has been laid out by many scholars, this current policy is based on a historical myth and a willful misinterpretation of the law by the open borders advocates. There aren't that many of them around. It's amazing. Who wants this? Who wants to have prisoners coming into our country? Who wants to have people who are very sick coming into our country? People from mental institutions coming into our country? And come they will. They're coming by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. As part of my plan to secure the border on day one of my new term in office, I will sign an executive order making clear to federal agencies that under the correct interpretation of the law, going forward, the future children of illegal aliens will not receive automatic U.S. citizenship. It's things like this that bring millions of people to our country.
And, to be fair, today, a lot of Americans of kind of all political persuasions would agree that, people who come here undocumented and then have children, right, those children should not be U.S. citizens. Why are they? Well, because the Constitution says so. However, there are some moves and some suggestions and some kind of movements, I guess, to try to adjust that and make it so that undocumented people cannot come here and have kids and their kids be U.S. citizens. These clauses were written centuries ago, but they still fuel our debates in a lot of really interesting and complicated ways. What I want to define is nativism, which is defined as a preference for the interests of native-born or established inhabitants over those of immigrants. Native-born in quotation marks because, again, some people would say, well, America is a nation of immigrants. Like, none of us are actually from here except for Native Americans. But regardless of your kind of opinion or response to that, nativism is a preference for kind of already established immigrant groups. For example, here are some contemporary expressions of nativism. A few years ago, the Syrian civil war was really raging and particularly hot and brutal, and hundreds of thousands of Syrians were trying to escape their country and trying to get somewhere else. Many of them tried to come to the United States, and many Americans didn't want them, right? And there was an entire kind of movement to kind of reduce or limit the number of refugees who could come into this country, right? And going back even further, this is an old sentiment. This is a political cartoon, I believe, from the 1920s or 30s, which we're going to get into very soon. So basically what I'm saying is what we're seeing on the left is kind of a contemporary iteration of what we're seeing on the right, is something that has been around for a long time. So nativism, long story short, is something that kind of tends to come in waves. There are millions of Americans that just have nativist sentiments who think that the people who are already here should be prioritized over people trying to come. Nativist rhetoric or movements tend to flare up anytime there's kind of a crisis that leads a lot of people to try to come to the United States, as we're going to see. The next word I want to talk about is assimilation. So assimilation is the process of a minority group adopting the values and behaviors of a majority group. Fears and concerns around assimilation, how is group X going to fit into our larger American framework or fabric? Right, kind of fears and concerns over that are one of the primary drivers of nativism throughout American history. And again, this goes back to some of that survey data I showed you at the beginning. Is America essentially a multicultural nation, or is America essentially kind of a monocultural nation that people who come here then kind of get absorbed into? And I guess depending on how you answer that question will depend on whether or not you think how and even if assimilation is the thing that should happen, right? And here's just some more contemporary examples of this. I feel like this has been less in the news recently, but maybe like 15 years ago, there was this huge kind of speak English movement. So the United States does not have a national language. I mean, obviously English is, nobody would dispute that English is the primary or dominant language in the United States. However, the United States has kind of no legally recognized national language. And again, about 15 years ago, there was this movement known as the English only movement, this movement to try to make English the official national language of the United States. Some of the more kind of like extreme manifestations of this kind of English only movement or just like English only sentiment is there are some Americans who believe that that, job applications and government forms should only be in English. We should not offer, forms in Arabic or forms in Spanish or forms in Hindi or whatever, that English should be the national and official language of the United States. And if you're going to come here, you should be forced to conform to that standard. Now, again, despite your opinions on these issues, I think it's undeniable that assimilation has been an issue throughout American history. Here's just a few more examples. During the kind of Manifest Destiny era, as, again, white Americans are moving further and further west and encountering Native Americans who are, fleeing for their lives in most cases, something known as the Indian School Movement. So essentially what these were, majority kind of white and explicitly Christian institutions that were trying to Christianize and quote unquote civilize and basically turn Native Americans into kind of like white versions of themselves. And, this was like assimilation at work, right? Like literally taking kind of racial and ethnic others and trying to mold them in kind of a more American, and in this case, like a white Christian image, right? But again, these issues have been around for a long time. And this concept of Americanization, right, kind of taking people from all over the world and turning them into this like one American kind of person, right, is a concern that Americans have had for a very, very long time. Now, assimilation is a huge issue. We're not going to look at today. Again, I could teach I could probably do a whole 3-hour lecture just on the issue of assimilation. And it's not going to come up too much today, but at least just wanted to mention it because it might be kind of operating in the background at various points. Last piece of vocabulary is a word we've encountered before. You probably don't need to write this down, but it is really important to kind of reintroduce this topic because you cannot talk about immigration without talking about whiteness. So again, quick refresher, whiteness is the historical project of defining what it means to be white in the United States. Now, again, when I say whiteness, I'm not talking about white people or white culture or whatever. I'm talking about this kind of historical project of identifying who is white and who is not. We've already talked about whiteness. We talked about race. We talked about Bacon's Rebellion. Quick refresher, was kind of like this really important moment where colonial legislatures started kind of legally delineating who was white and who was not. And so another example, this is Homer Plessy. Quick refresher, when we talked about jazz in New Orleans, Homer Plessy was a Creole of color who viewed himself as a Creole of color, who looks mostly white, but had some Black ancestry in him, and was prosecuted for riding in the whites section of a segregated train in New Orleans, which eventually led to this really consequential Supreme Court case. So again, both of these are things we talked about, but just to remind you that these are examples of whiteness, right? I'm not talking about like white people or white history. I'm talking about this idea, this kind of project of delineating who is white and who is not.
Virginia was the first state to establish a comprehensive slave code, and it served as a model for other states in the following years. This reinforced this idea of an other, a natural enemy to whites who were made to believe their whiteness was the norm and everyone else was someone to be suspicious of.
They hate white people because white people are successful and they're not.
It's this idea that white is right and other cultures are inherently wrong that's carried through our nation's history throughout waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century until today.
Where did any other subgroup of people contribute more to civilization?
Than white people?
Than Western civilization itself, that's rooted in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States of America.
Okay. But there was a time when Irish, Italians, Jews, Eastern Europeans, they all weren't considered white. In fact, the Irish were commonly compared to blacks when they first came to the US and even lived and worked side by side with each other. But you had to earn your white card and it wasn't easy. Over time, the Irish, along with Germans, Italians, and other Europeans, have been folded into this idea of whiteness, which is super helpful since the Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted naturalization to free white persons. When huge numbers of immigrants were coming to the US at the turn of the 20th century, resources and jobs were scarce. European immigrants, like many of the Irish, locked down the cheapest and most menial jobs. They rose up by the time labor unions were forming and managed to keep black workers from joining. They also actively fought against the abolitionist movement. Now, obviously there were exceptions to the rule, and no one label can describe an entire group of people. But for the most part, each group was willing to throw other groups under the bus to climb the social ladder.
Okay, with that vocabulary in mind, let's now get to our first major, I think, really important moment in the history of kind of federal immigration law, And I'm calling this title Nativism, the Irish, and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Like those are three different things, but hopefully I'll kind of relate them all together and make some really, I think, important big scale generalizations about how immigration works in the United States. So let's start with the Irish, and I'm going to start with a really dumb question. Are Irish people white? Now, again, you're probably thinking, oh, that's a dumb question. Of course they're white. However, let's look at a few things to kind of show you that this question is actually not as dumb as it appears on the surface. So let's check it out. For its first century, the U.S. had no comprehensive immigration process. Now, again, as we saw with the Naturalization Act of 1790, there were some general laws and principles about how you became a U.S. citizen. However, in terms of, who could come to this country, what countries wanted to come to this country, there were really no laws or codes or anything. It was just pretty open. However, cultural ties with Europe meant that virtually all early immigrants were British, German, or Dutch, right? So again, if you look at roughly the first century of the United States, so, with the signing of, the ratification of the Constitution, kind of 100 years after that, for the most part, people who came here were British, German, or Dutch. Why? Well, because those groups were already kind of established here, and it just made sense that they had cultural ties, so people just kept coming. By the way, British includes Scottish and Irish, but primarily English, right? So there were some Scots-Irish people here as well, but not enough to become controversial, as we're going to find out soon. The vast majority of people who came here early on were people who knew or were somehow culturally tied to people they already knew. However, we should acknowledge that many of the people, eventually millions of the people who were coming here, were not coming as immigrants, right? They were coming here not voluntarily. They're coming here as enslaved folks of African descent. We've already talked about slavery at length, I think, and we're not going to talk about it again today. I, at least, though, wanted to acknowledge that many of the people who are being brought here or who are coming here on ships are not being brought here voluntarily. So immigration did not really become controversial until the 1840s, when millions of Irish started coming to the U.S. fleeing a famine. I'm going to play a clip about it pretty soon that'll kind of explain that. But basically, there is the primary crop that poor Irish people were living off of was potatoes. There was this huge kind of blight or like disease that killed a lot of crops off, and millions of Irish were starving, and a lot of them start coming here. Now, there were some Irish people here, but for the most part, immigration from England was primarily English, some Scottish, and even less Irish. And that flips in the 1840s. And what happens? Well, some Americans start to embrace nativism. Now, nativism had kind of always been around, but this is really kind of the first kind of large-scale nativist movement opposing Irish immigration. Why? Well, they viewed the Irish as a plague of Catholics trying to infiltrate Protestant America and spread anti-American values. America's first hated immigrants. Here is a political cartoon. I don't have a date on this. This is from the late 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere in that era. And this is a political cartoon, again, kind of like denigrating and demonizing Irish immigrants. Where do we see the Irish immigrants? Anytime you see someone who kind of looks like the Grinch from The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, right? That is an Irish person. Now, why were they depicted this way? Well, unfortunately, as we've seen a little bit, as we're going to see more today, there is a long tradition in America of kind of demonizing groups that we dislike, Native Americans, Black people, and then eventually the Irish, right? So that when the Irish start coming in large numbers, they kind of got filtered into this tradition of kind of like making monsters, right, of various groups that Americans at large didn't like or didn't want. And all over the place, if you look at political cartoons from this era, Irish people, in particular Irish men, are depicted as almost like subhuman apes. Which again was similar to how Black men in particular were presented in political cartoons as well. So they kind of got lumped into this tradition of looking down on and dehumanizing various groups. Now, what you wouldn't know from looking at this picture is there were a lot of stereotypes, just like there are stereotypes about various groups that Americans dislike. The Irish were considered drunks. They were considered violent. They were considered kind of poor and dirty. And that's really what's being depicted here, right? These Irish kind of like rowdy, drunken, angry Irishmen who are like beating up some good, honest, Anglo cops in some random American city. Here's another political cartoon capturing some of these anti-Irish views. Whenever I show this to my students and I say, can you interpret this for me? Nobody can figure out what's going on here, which is fine. That's part of my job, right? Okay, so let me identify a few things here. These people right here are basically just kind of like average good, white Americans, and they're looking at some threat that is coming across the ocean. Well, what is the threat? Well, it's really hard. Obviously, there's some kind of like crocodile or alligator type creatures, but what's hard to see is that this kind of alligator or crocodile mouth is, I guess we call like a Pope hat. So these are called miters, M-I-T-E-R or R-E. There's two different spellings, and if you just Google the Pope, you'll see a picture of the Pope wearing one of these hats. So the hat's kind of turned sideways and turned into this like evil kind of gaping mouth, with like slime and slobber dripping from it. And the people coming out of the ocean, who are they? Well, those are Irish immigrants. And why are they wearing this hat? Well, the hat is to signify that they are Catholic. And this building in the background is supposed to symbolize like the Vatican, right? Which is like where the Pope kind of rules from or whatever. And it's almost like the Vatican is sending these kind of like monstrous, evil Irish Catholics to like literally come and devour, good white Protestant Christian America. And here we see in the background, it says U.S. public school, and it's like crumbling, right? And there's an American flag turned upside down. What's that about? Going back to when we talked about kind of Christianity in the United States, there were these traditions that a lot of states had of daily prayer and Bible reading. Well, Catholics hated those traditions. Why? Well, because they read a different Bible than the one the Catholics believe in, and because a lot of Catholics didn't want their kids to be turned into Protestants, right? So again, this was all kind of turned around as this very like anti-immigrant, anti-Irish sentiment, right? These kind of like Catholic, not really completely white Europeans are coming here and they're going to devour our society from inside out. And this political cartoon is like really, really, really disturbingly, but very like powerfully and accurately representing these fears. When we talked about kind of the growth of the American cities, and I said how basically like every disliked or despised group that comes here in the early 20th century is kind of forced to live in ghettos. And that's exactly what happened with the Irish, right? And to this day, there are, old Irish pubs in America's cities all across the country that have been around since the early 20th century. Why? Well, because Irish people are forced to live in these ghettos and they bring their culture with them. And part of their culture is kind of this like pub culture, right? Which again was turned against them and used as a stereotype that the Irish are all angry drunks. And this is part of the reason why we don't want them. Now, the whole time I've been talking about the Irish and how disliked they were, hopefully you're making connections, right? There are various groups today that some people dislike. And again, going back to Trump's travel ban, why did Trump pledge to ban people from majority Muslim countries? Well, because there's a lot of Americans today, particularly white conservative Americans, who believe that Islam is completely incompatible with American values. Let me explain what we're seeing here in this picture to the right. So Sharia law, you can see, says no Sharia laws allowed. Sharia law is basically it's kind of like an Islamic law code. So just like if you read the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures or whatever, there's all these rules and laws about how ancient Israel society was supposed to operate. There's something kind of similar in kind of Islamic traditions. And on the kind of extreme right, there's this conspiracy theory that there's going to be so many immigrants from Muslim countries that they're going to basically overturn the laws of America and, force Sharia law or Islamic law on the rest of us. Now, the vast majority of Americans think this is ridiculous. The vast majority of Muslims think this is ridiculous. But all that is to say that what we're seeing on the right here is really like a manifestation and an iteration of a very old American tradition of being suspicious and fearful of religious minorities, I think in particular with the Irish, and expressing this fear that these religious minorities are going to force their religion on the rest of us and completely change the unique character of American society. We talked about religion, let's talk about race now. Racially, the Irish were viewed as not white. So initially, when Irish people first started coming here, they were viewed as kind of occupying a social space between whiteness and blackness, right? Economically speaking, the U.S., however, needed the Irish to fill dirty jobs that many Americans didn't want, right? Hope this is all sounding familiar, right? The reason I want to talk about the Irish really is the Irish kind of set a template for every kind of new group that starts coming in large numbers to the United States. Being distrusted, being viewed as kind of subversive and destructive to American, democratic and or religious norms, bringing anti-American values, stealing our jobs. These are very, 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 very old rhetorics. And again, the Irish, I think, are prototypical in kind of setting a template for other groups. Okay, so let me just put this together and then we'll kind of shift gears and look at the Chinese Exclusion Act. Quick refresher, in academic settings, whiteness and blackness do not refer to skin color. They are terms used to describe the historical project of defining what it means to be white and black in the US. And again, the Irish really illustrate this. They didn't start out as white. When they first got here, they were considered kind of, again, in between whiteness and blackness. And this picture is kind of illustrating this. This picture is kind of showing this slow transition. Now, we have a black person and an Irish person. Again, the Irish person being, again, kind of looking like the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, kind of animalistic, right? And then we have this black person in this very, again, very stereotypical kind of, idiotic grin that you see in a lot of old racist political cartoons and propaganda and stuff, right? And where are they? They're balancing out, right? It's kind of arguing that, we dislike black people as much as we dislike Irish people. However, we see kind of underneath the Irish person, it says white, right? So over time, the Irish kind of became white. Well, how did that happen? Well, basically by the early 20th century, the urban Irish just got big enough and got politically organized. And this is sad, but it's true, they had largely adopted the racist attitudes and practices of white supremacy. They had assimilated by becoming white. So, today, if you say you're the Irish white, people are going to be like, what's a stupid question? But if you took a time machine back 130 years ago, that was not a stupid question. That was a really, 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 really important question, as millions of Irish are coming to these countries, settling in cities, settling in ghettos, and in the minds of a lot of Americans, kind of threatening the essential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nature of this country. Which is, again, why the Irish are prototypical and why other groups that come have kind of similar stories, right? So let's look at one of those other groups and kind of compare and contrast them. We're going to look at the Chinese coming to this country in large numbers. Again, about the same time, 1850s, as the Irish are coming. Now, there were almost no Chinese people, or just Asian people in general, in the United States before 1850, and that starts to change in the mid 20th century. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. One of them, back to this whole push-pull thing, there was a kind of major kind of civil war in China in the mid 1800s. And, as always happens with war, there are refugees. And initially, it wasn't that many. It's just thousands start coming to the West Coast of the United States and kind of California in particular, as well as the East Coast, New York. So as we're going to find out, New York and California were kind of the two main destinations for Chinese immigrants. And again, far less than what we saw with other groups. It was just, we're talking thousands as opposed to millions. Well, as we'll find out, it was enough to make Americans concerned. Now, they're also being pulled, right? So they're being pushed by circumstances, and they're also being pulled by circumstances. For example, the gold rush was happening in California, and a lot of people were striking it rich. Not that many, but enough. but they were advertising people to come. So some Chinese Americans, and particularly men, start settling in the West Coast to try to strike it rich in the gold rush, and also to find labor. So this is again, kind of the end of the middle of the Manifest Destiny era, where we're trying to move further and further west. One of the ways we do that is by building railroads. And Chinese and Irish, as it turns out, kind of, again, immigrants tend to take jobs that the rest of America doesn't want. And the Chinese and the Irish both were very instrumental in building the railroad as it's moving further and further west. And like the Irish, they settled in kind of ethnic or immigrant ghettos. And all across America, particularly on the coasts, you have the emergence of Chinatowns. So, New York has a huge Chinatown to this day. Actually, this is San Francisco here. We see this is New York City, probably the two biggest Chinatowns in America. Well, why? Well, because most Chinese immigrants who are coming in this era are settling either in New York City or various Californian cities, right? Okay, so what I want to do now, and again, you're already seeing some similarities with the Irish story, right? What I want to do now is talk particularly about the experience of Chinese immigrants and how that shaped the law, and also how the experiences of Chinese immigrants versus Irish immigrants are both similar and different, right? Because of reasons we'll get into. Okay, so in terms of your notes, this is the first important fact. 1850s, Chinese immigrants come to CA's California, NY's New York, fleeing war and looking for economic opportunity. Now, it took about 3 decades, but eventually there were enough Chinese immigrants that Americans started to be unhappy about it for reasons we're going to unpack shortly. But for now, let's just say this. In 1882, Congress passes the first piece of meaningful immigration legislation. And when I say first piece, I mean like ever. Like, again, as I said earlier, for about a century, immigration was not really a concern. The Irish and the Chinese, however, changed that. And Congress responds by passing the first piece of meaningful immigration legislation. Responding to nativist sentiments, the act being the Chinese Exclusion Act, banned all Chinese immigration for 10 years. It was repeatedly renewed until 1943. And as we're going to find out, that had a huge negative impact on the number of Chinese people in America, basically up till today, honestly. Although there's certainly more, there are not as many as there probably could or should have been if this had never happened. And here's just, again, political cartoons are really, really good ways to capture some of these movements in American society. So here's a political cartoon from the era. And it says, notice, communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. Oh, there's a lot there. Now, some of these are groups you might recognize, some of them are not. But basically, this is a kind of like, so this is kind of, this actually political cartoon is more from kind of the early 20th century. Because again, even though the Chinese Exclusion Act happened in the 1880s, it was renewed repeatedly for decades. And these are various groups that people were concerned about in the early 20th century. So communists, we all know what communists are, I assumed. Nihilists, these are kind of European intellectuals who think that nothing is true and life is meaningless or whatever. Socialists, pretty similar to communists. Fenians, so the Fenians were a group of kind of radical left-wing Irish that, a lot of anti-immigration folks were concerned about. And hoodlum just means like someone who commits crimes. So basically what this political cartoon is saying that like these other groups are coming and we're not banning them or barring them from coming in. However, Chinese people across the board were, denied access to, as I said, the Golden Gate of Liberty, right? And at the bottom it says the only one barred out. So this is an interesting political cartoon because it actually is kind of empathetic to the plight of Chinese people who want to come to the United States, but as this political cartoon shows, they were not able to. Here's another political cartoon. This one is a little less kind. So here is a Chinese person kind of taking the place of the Statue of Liberty, right? And there's some imagery here that you're not going to understand, so let me just explain it to you. In the person's hand, you see a pipe. Okay, so opium, right? Opium is a drug that various human societies have done for centuries. However, there was a kind of tradition of kind of smoking opium in China at that time, and some of the immigrants who were coming to America were bringing this with them. So right away there was a concern that well they're gonna bring drugs into our country, right? Which is a problem, which is a concern people still have today. You can see too that this Chinese man's foot is on a skull, which again this is not very subtle imagery, basically arguing that it will bring kind of like disease and death with them. And here, some of these are obscured. I can't completely read them, but we see ruin, we see diseases, immorality, filth. So again, this is like really, really ugly, not subtle language. And then also in the background, I just noticed this. If you look at the moon, I believe this is the moon. It seems like it's nighttime, either the moon or the sun, but whatever celestial bodies in the sky has this very like stereotypically kind of racist caricature of the face of a Chinese person, right? Chinese man in particular, I think. So this was the sentiment, right? This is how most Americans viewed Chinese immigrants. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, again, was, an outgrowth of this anti-Chinese sentiment.
After 12 years living in California, Chinese citizen Che Chan-ping was ready for a visit home. He procured the necessary documents for his departure and return journey and set sail for China, where he spent the next year reconnecting with friends and family. But when he returned to San Francisco on October 8, 1888, Ping and his fellow immigrant passengers were forbidden to disembark. Just days earlier, President Grover Cleveland had signed the Scott Act, which invalidated the legal documents allowing their re-entry to the United States. This policy threatened to separate families and deprive Chinese immigrants of their homes and livelihoods. Ping challenged the ruling, beginning a legal battle for the rights of thousands of Chinese immigrants. But his case inspired an even more controversial policy that continues to impact immigrants around the globe. Discrimination against Chinese immigrants had begun decades earlier, when the California gold rush created a massive demand for labor. Initially, Chinese immigrants were welcomed as reliable workers and became essential parts of frontier communities. Many built railroads and worked in the mines, while others operated laundries, restaurants, and general stores. The 1868 Burlingame Treaty even granted China favored trading status with the US. and allowed unrestricted migration between the two countries. But as large numbers of Chinese immigrants found success, American workers began to see them as a threat. Politicians and labor leaders denounced them for driving down wages, and violence against Chinese individuals became increasingly common. This anti-Chinese sentiment soon found its way into California's courts. In 1854, following a murder trial where a white man was convicted of murdering a Chinese man, the California Supreme Court overturned the conviction, holding that Chinese eyewitness testimony was inadmissible. The court declared that Chinese citizens could not testify against white defendants, citing similar precedents forbidding testimony by Black and Native American individuals. This decision effectively legalized violence against California's Chinese population, inspiring mob attacks and campaigns for segregation. Before long, anti-Chinese sentiment reached the federal level. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law that restricted immigration based explicitly on nationality. In practice, the act banned entry to all ethnically Chinese immigrants besides diplomats and prohibited existing immigrants from obtaining citizenship. It also meant Chinese individuals couldn't leave the United States and return without first applying for a certificate of re-entry. This policy remained in place until October 1, 1888, when the Scott Act prohibited re-entry altogether, stranding Che Jianping and thousands of other Chinese immigrants. In court, Ping argued he had followed the proper protocol obtaining his re-entry certificate, and the government had not honored his legally issued document. This argument was strong enough to send his case all the way to the Supreme Court, but the justices ruled against Ping, invalidating thousands of legal re-entry certificates in one fell swoop. The decision led to Ping's deportation and left up to 20,000 Chinese immigrants unable to return to the US. But arguably even more important than the court's racist ruling was the logic they used to support it. Traditionally, the Supreme Court is considered a check on the other two branches of American government, offering judgment on policies passed by Congress and the President. In this case, however, the court stated they had no power to pass judgment on the Scott Act, since Congress had declared the immigration policy a matter of national security. This decision set a unique precedent. Unless Ping's case was overturned, congressional and executive branches could claim national security concerns to pass whatever immigration laws they wanted. Throughout the 20th century, xenophobic government officials used this power to freely discriminate against immigrant groups. The 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act prohibited the entry of all South Asians, and a series of immigration acts in the 1920s expanded restrictions throughout Asia, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe.
And unfortunately, as we've talked about in the past, when the majority of Americans don't want certain racial or ethnic groups to be part of their society, they pass laws barring marriage between these groups and white people, right? And I'm not going to read this to you. I mean, even just this language is shocking to us, but this is like, mainstream American newspapers were talking like this, right? We talked about before, these miscegenation laws were all over the country and they were flexible, right? As various groups start coming in large numbers, these laws were often updated to target or identify certain groups and saying, okay, this group, before they weren't a problem, quote unquote problem, but now they are. So we're going to pass laws saying that they can't intermarry with white people. These laws were very effective just in terms of slowing down immigration from these countries that people didn't want. For example, here is, so what we're looking at here is just kind of the raw Chinese American population throughout these decades. These are not showing numbers of immigrants. This is just like census data for population, right? As you can see in 1850, only a handful, a few thousand Chinese people. That number goes up and up and up and up. By the time we get to the late 1800s, the 1880s and 90s, the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we have roughly 100,000 Chinese people. And that number precipitously goes down. Well, why? Well, because fewer, and eventually no Chinese immigrants were coming, and Chinese people who were here, were getting married and having kids and stuff, but a lot of them were dying off. Or some of them were going back because they knew they weren't wanted here. So again, Chinese Exclusion Act was pretty effective. And here we can also see like the numbers of Japanese. There's so many things I can't talk about in the context of this class. I will just briefly say this. We have the Japanese, we have Koreans, right? We have Filipinos. We have various groups that start coming in different kind of waves in American history, all of them coming to fill jobs that Americans don't want. And many of them, again, facing the same discrimination and persecution and anti-immigrant sentiments that the previous groups had experienced. Which again, there's so many things I can't talk about, but I just at least want to mention that there are other Asian groups that start coming in large numbers. Now, it's just going to do a quick like compare and contrast, like a Venn diagram. The experience of the Irish and the Chinese are very similar in some ways. However, they're different in really, really, really important and consequential ways. And what I mean by important and consequential, just in terms of helping us understand how immigration works in the United States or has worked historically. So again, in terms of your notes, I don't think you have to write every single one of these points down, but this probably definitely will be on the exam. The similarities and differences between the Irish and the Chinese immigration experiences. So both the Irish and the Chinese were persecuted, right? They were mistreated by kind of the vast majority when they got here. They were viewed as immoral. They were viewed as a threat to security. So again, going back to the Trump travel ban, this is a very old concern. Throughout history, we have denied people from various countries from coming here. And again, maybe you're saying for good reason, but there are just certain parts of the world where people maybe have political ideologies that we don't want here. However, whether that's true or not, it often gets thrown at various groups who we just don't want, right? A concern over stealing our jobs, right? That again, this is a very old concern, and both groups were accused of doing that. Both groups were viewed as non-Christian and as a threat to the essential Christian nature of this country, and viewed as non-white. Again, the Irish eventually, as we're going to learn, were able to kind of what some historians would call work towards whiteness. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think this is where the important difference comes in, right? And again, race comes into play. These are, the Irish and the Chinese had similar experiences, but race was really the factor that made their experiences diverge, right? So here's what I mean. Since the Irish were ethnically European, they were eventually able to become white and therefore be fully accepted, right? Chinese, however, were not. Since the Chinese were ethnically Asian, they were not able to become white, quote unquote, and struggled for full acceptance. And some people would say still struggle for full acceptance today. And I think some recent events that happened over the past 5 or 6 years, I think, are a good illustration of that. I'm going to pause here and just play a video to kind of show you what I mean.
Along with a growing number of infections, the coronavirus is spreading fear and discrimination against Asian Americans. Restaurants and other businesses in cities from New York to California have reported big drops in sales. We're also learning about reports of racist incidents at hotels and bullying of Asian American students. Weijia Zhang visited a struggling Chinese restaurant in New York City. Weijia, what did you learn?
Oh, good morning, Anthony. It is clear that Asian Americans are facing discrimination over a disease that does not discriminate. The CDC says Asians are not more likely to contract or spread coronavirus than anyone else. Politicians are now working to combat racism, but one restaurant owner we spoke to said the damage is done.
How has coronavirus impacted your business?
Tremendous. Ken Lam's family has owned a popular New York City dim sum restaurant for more than 4 decades.
You've been through SARS, you've been through swine flu.
Yes.
Is coronavirus different when it comes to business?
Yes. And then when you talk about swine flu and H1N1, we didn't feel anything at all.
Lam says he's lost $1.5 million and business is down around 50%.
What do you think the reason is?
The reason is because Chinese started the coronavirus, but they're just scared to get infected by Chinese people.
And they think Chinese people are at a Chinese restaurant?
Yes, yes.
And it's not just at restaurants.
You haven't heard of the coronavirus?
So what does that have to do with us?
Last month, a man posted videos on Facebook that appear to show employees at 2 hotels in Indiana turning him away.
So no Asians can stay here. Why is that? because of virus.
CBS News reached out to the alleged victim but did not hear back. Wyndham Hotels and Resorts, which owns both hotels, said in a statement they are deeply troubled by these incidents as they are not reflective of our values or our expectations of franchisees, and they're treating this matter seriously. The racism has also surfaced in classrooms. In Madison, Wisconsin, school officials say there's been comments made toward Asian students, and they're working to stop those responsible.
And really seizing that moment to educate that student so they understand that their words have meaning and can be hurtful.
Now, to be fair, I think some of the things discussed in this video does not represent a majority of Americans. I think most Americans think that some of this rhetoric that came out of COVID was really gross and disreputable. However, putting it in context, it is part of a very long tradition. Right? As ugly as it is an important part of our history that we need to understand and wrestle with and face. Now, on a slightly more neutral tone, all of this led to the creation of what we now would recognize as kind of a federal immigration system, right? So again, before the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was no system, there wasn't a real system in place, and that this really encouraged the federal government to put a system in place. So later that year, Congress also passed the Immigration Act of 1882, which created the first federal immigration bureaucracy and solidified the United States' right to restrict certain groups from coming in by barring criminals, the mentally unwell, or any person unable to take care of him or herself. So again, then as now, the United States gets to kind of pick and choose what types of people that we want to come. And why? Well, it was because very early on at the creation of the federal immigration bureaucracy, this is what we decided. And I think this really ties into the podcast. So basically Ellis Island and that whole kind of history and story that the podcast told you directly comes out of these immigration laws in the 1880s that, created the federal, bureaucracy of immigration that we still have today. Obviously, it's very different today, but the bureaucracy that we have basically came to us via the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as the podcast, I think, very, very heartrendingly said, there were people who tried to come here and were turned away because they were ill or because, in some cases they couldn't read or whatever. So long story short, I'm not going to lecture on the podcast. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It did a good job of detailing that. However, the point is, there is a long history in our immigration policy of deciding who we want and who we don't. And that has kind of always been the case as it is today in a lot of ways. So let's move on now to our next major act that we're going to look at, which is the Immigration Act of 1924, which again was inspired by a wave of immigration from certain parts of the world that kind of a plurality or a majority of Americans didn't want. European Jews are not the only ones, but I think they're going to be the focus of this next section. Now, before the 20th century, there were some Jewish people living in the United States, but there were not that many. There were these little pockets here and there in places like New York City and whatnot. But large-scale Jewish migration to the United States happened, back to the push-pull thing, because of kind of wide-scale persecution. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, the Holocaust. Obviously, Jewish people were fleeing Europe because of the Holocaust, but this is decades and decades and decades before. There was, unfortunately, a tradition of persecuting Jews in various parts of Europe that predated, but also kind of set the stage for the Holocaust. So in particular, there are these things known as pogroms. So a pogrom is a campaign of anti-Jewish violence. They happen kind of all across Eastern Europe in particular, starting in the 1880s. Eastern European Jews endured several waves of pogroms in places like Poland, Russia, as well as some other kind of modern-day Eastern European countries. Here's a little video about that. I'll just kind of give you some overview of what some European Jewish people were experiencing and how and why they came to the United States in the late early 1900s. Okay, I want to unpack some things said in that video, and I think we should start by talking about this, which is anti-Semitism. Now, unfortunately, dislike and hatred of Jewish people is a very, very old tradition, going back not just centuries, but thousands of years, as we're going to learn in a second. So I do think before proceeding, I should just pause and just kind of like talk about, well, like what is anti-Semitism, and why does it exist? And where does it come from? Well, it comes from kind of religious history, right? So now think back when we talked about Christianity. I didn't really talk about Jesus that much. So quick historical overview, right? Jesus was this Jewish teacher who walked around first century Palestine, said some interesting things, and he was considered in his time a Messiah figure. So what was the Messiah figure? Well, basically the Messiah was a person who was going to overthrow whatever group was oppressing the Jews at the time, because, you know, again, oppression of the Jews is a very old thing. At the time, it was the Roman Empire. And the thought was Jesus was the Messiah who was going to overthrow the Roman Empire and basically reestablish the kingdom of Israel, right? Which had been kind of repeatedly decimated by various imperial powers over the course of ancient history. However, Jesus died, and some of his followers started to believe that he had resurrected from the dead, which proved in the minds of his followers that he was the Son of God, right? So why am I saying all this? Well, because Christianity did not start out as a religion. Christianity started out as a sect of Judaism, right? Jesus was Jewish. Very much, actually, all of his followers, as far as we know, were in the earliest days were Jewish. Now, this is really important to understand, because what we now call Christianity just started out as a Jewish sect, right? So here's a fun little picture. You know, we've all seen pictures of Jesus. We have no idea what he looks like, obviously, but I think this is a fun picture because it is kind of almost like arguing and reminding us that like Jesus was essentially Jewish, right? However, over time, most of the people who embraced Christianity were Gentiles. So Gentile is a Jewish term for anyone who is non-Jewish. And by the time we get to the kind of 150, 200 years after Jesus was born, the vast majority of people who identified as Christian were not Jewish. And eventually, what started out as a sect of Judaism, again, people who followed Jesus were initially just Jewish people who believed his teachings. And by the time we get about 150, 200 years away from Jesus's birth, you have a situation in which Christianity is a separate religion from Judaism and is a majority Gentile, meaning non-Jewish faith, right? Now, we mentioned this briefly when we talked about the Reformation, but by the time we get into the 300s, the Roman Empire had really fully embraced Christianity. You know, initially Christianity was a persecuted religion, or at least a minority religion. And by the time we get to the kind of late 300s, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And out of that, we get, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, quote unquote, which is why we call it the Roman Catholic Church, because it basically descends from the era when the Roman Empire embraced Christianity. And Christianity, long story short, had just got increasingly powerful, and for a good 1,000 years, basically until the Protestant Reformation, like 1,200, 1,300 years actually. Christianity was a very, very powerful religion. It was the religion of empire, the religion of war, of conquest, and unfortunately, sometime during this period, actually, I would say at various points during this period, you had different Christians, different priests, different influential people, basically arguing that the roots of Christianity in Judaism demanded kind of like a response, right? Because why? Well, because the Jews were the people who killed Jesus, right? If you read the narratives in the New Testament or like the Christian scriptures of what happened to Jesus during his crucifixion, basically the Jewish people thought he was a blasphemer and demanded that the Roman Empire crucify him. And this really, unfortunately, is kind of the roots of anti-Semitism, is kind of anti-Jewish Christian rhetoric that says, the Jewish people are evil, right? The Jewish people destroyed our Lord and Savior, and therefore that justifies us persecuting them. Now, to be fair, I think today, especially in America, most Christians are not anti-Semitic. In fact, for decades and decades and decades, kind of conservative evangelical Christians have been some of the biggest supporters of Jewish folks, in particular, kind of the nation state of Israel, right, as it currently exists. However, kind of sitting alongside of this history of support for Israel is this very long history of Christian anti-Semitism.
The COVID-19 pandemic upturned the world, creating both health and economic disasters. Along with these disasters came another persistent threat, a rise in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism means prejudice against or hatred of Jews. In times of economic or political turmoil, we often look for something or someone to blame. For centuries, starting with the crucifixion of Jesus, Jews have been a frequent scapegoat, falsely blamed for catastrophic events. In the Middle Ages, when the bubonic plague was destroying Europe, Jews were wrongly accused of spreading it by poisoning drinking wells. It was even said that Jews murdered Christian babies to use their blood in religious rituals. This so-called blood libel led to massacres of Jews between the 12th and 16th centuries. Fast forward to the early 1900s, and the devastation caused by the First World War made many people look for simple explanations for what had caused the conflict, or influenced its outcome. In Germany, defeated military leaders spread lies that German Jews had betrayed their country, stabbing it in the back and causing it to lose the war. In addition to having lost the First World War, Germany was struggling through the Great Depression of the 1930s. This made many citizens even more desperate for someone to blame for the economic disaster. The Nazi Party that rose to power in 1933 exploited this unrest. They began depicting Jews as the enemy of the German people.
Wir erkennen, dass hier ein Pestherd liegt, der die Gesundheit der arischen Völker bedroht.
They said that Jews were an internal source of contagion or disease in Europe that had to be wiped out. Through official state channels, Nazis said that Jews were the reason for Germany's misfortune. They exploited the general population's readiness to scapegoat Jews by enacting laws that targeted the freedoms of the Jewish people. Sometimes called the longest hatred, anti-Semitism has persisted for thousands of years. No matter how much the world changes, anti-Semitism adapts, flaring up again and again during turbulent times.
Coronavirus lockdowns and COVID conspiracies are being blamed for a rise in anti-Semitism.
This persistent nature, not grounded in facts or reality, is what makes it so dangerous and deadly. If history has taught us anything, it's that we can never ignore it, overlook it, or accept it.
Okay, so let's put all this together and get some notes down. Western Christianity has historically been anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, right? Even though that's less so the case today, historically speaking, that has been the case. So why? Here are some reasons dealt with in the video, and some additional ones that I'm throwing out there that I think are really important. The core reason is this, right? Some blame the Jews for quote unquote killing God or crucifying Jesus. And this has bred conspiracy theories. There are a lot of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. I'm just going to highlight two that I think are particularly, unfortunately, powerful and very, very, very much in circulation in kind of anti-Semitic circles online in particular. The first conspiracy theory being the blood libel conspiracy. Blood libel is the view that Jews kill Christians to use their blood in ritual sacrifices. And again, for centuries and centuries and centuries, there were Christians in kind of Western Europe who believed this. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's really stupid. Nobody believes that today. But there are iterations of this belief today, right? Because oftentimes poisonous ideas, they'll change and morph and look different from where they started, but they're still very much around. So here is a kind of old, this looks like kind of like from the medieval era. I forgot to get a date on this. This is probably like 1200s, 1300s, showing this view that that Jewish people were killing Christian children to use in their blood rituals and sacrifices, right? So here we have a bunch of Jewish men basically bleeding a Christian white kid to death, right? Which is ridiculous, right? And nobody believes that anymore. However, oh wait, some people still do believe a version of this. So what we're seeing at the top is a reference to the QAnon conspiracy theory, right? We've talked about it before. QAnon is the belief that kind of liberal elites who control government who control the government are, cannibalizing and sacrificing babies in satanic rituals. And QAnon has its roots in anti-Semitism, right? Again, this idea that these evil, corrupted Jewish people at the highest levels of American and global society are performing these satanic rituals, using the blood of our children, right? It's ridiculous, but again, it is a ridiculous idea that has been around for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. The next conspiracy theory and final one I want to talk about before looking again, going back to the experience of Jewish immigrants, is the International Jewish Conspiracy. This is a conspiracy that has different names and many, many different iterations, but again, is very old. What does it believe? It believes that Jews are secretly trying to rule the world. Here's an example from the kind of mid-20th century. This is a piece of Nazi propaganda. Now, I don't read German, so I don't know what this says. But basically, I know who these three people are. Roosevelt was the president of the United States during World War II. Churchill was the prime minister of England during World War II. And Stalin was the leader of Russia during World War II. Again, England, the United States, Russia were the kind of the core of the kind of international coalition that defeated the Nazis. And basically what this piece of propaganda is saying is that they are all being controlled by these secretive, shadowy Jewish elites who are working behind the scenes. And this is part of the reason why the Holocaust was justified, right? Because if we don't exterminate them, they're going to exterminate us, right? Because they already run the world. And again, this is ridiculous, but there are still people who believe this. For example, on the kind of alt-right or the extreme right, there's a lot of hatred of a guy named George Soros. Many of you probably never heard of George Soros. You can Google him if you want. Basically, he's the super rich Jewish American guy who funds a lot of liberal and progressive initiatives all across America and all across the world. He's basically a really wealthy philanthropist who funds progressive causes. Obviously, if you're super conservative, you don't like George Soros, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with disliking George Soros. However, a lot of the rhetoric against George Soros is very much couched in this extreme anti-Semitic beliefs, right? So it's not just that like George Soros is a rich guy who I don't like. George Soros is part of this like international Jewish conspiracy to force progressive values and programs on, the good, hardworking white conservatives of America, right? And what we're seeing here, this is Alex Jones, by the way. Some of you know Alex Jones. He's a really influential conspiracy theorist on the right, is known for spreading a lot of these anti-Semitic ideas, couched in this kind of like neutral language of, we're just opposing these progressive causes. But long story short, anti-Semitism is very much alive and well, and it has shaped all kinds of things. But as we're going to see, to get back to what we were talking about originally, and realize I kind of took us on a long segue, really shaped immigration policy in the early 20th century. So let's look at that. In 1924, years of conflict in Europe prompted waves of Italian, Eastern European, and Jewish immigration. So we're not going to talk about the Italians because we can't talk about everything, but they were also kind of swept up in this anti-immigrant fervor. And Eastern European and Jewish, they're not mutually exclusive, but they kind of overlap, right? So most of the immigrants from Eastern European were Jewish, and most of the Jewish immigrants coming at this time were Eastern European, but sometimes those were two separate things. Either way, Eastern Europeans and Jewish people were part of this kind of disliked wave of immigration. At the same time, Korean and Filipino laborers had increased on the West Coast after Chinese exclusion. After Chinese exclusion, a lot of people, particularly on the West Coast, needed cheap labor. So they started looking to Japan and Korea and the Philippines, bringing people over here to work in the kinds of jobs that most white Americans didn't want. However, that did not stop kind of the masses of white Americans from reacting negatively to this. Nativists called for further restrictions. Now, before digging into the specifics of the act, I did want to show you two more political cartoons. This is a really disturbing but really interesting political cartoon. This is an anti-Italian political cartoon. So again, Italians were Catholics, right? Italians were white, but they were Southern European and maybe in some cases a little darker, a little more swarthy or whatever. So as we see here in this image, they are being depicted as this kind of like threatening non-white horde, right? And if you look very carefully at some of the things we see mafia, right? Again, immigrants are more prone to criminality in the minds of a lot of anti-immigrant people. So that was the case back then as well. There is this sense that, Europe is dumping their unwanted, poor, criminal, maybe mentally ill people on our shores. And that's why we see here direct from the slums of Europe daily. Were some Italian immigrants in the mafia? Were some of them anarchists? Were some of them socialists? Of course. Yeah, sure. But then as now, there is a tendency to kind of lump everyone into one giant group of kind of unwanted, threatening, scary. And that's what we see here. And here we see Uncle Sam, who's it's kind of hard to tell what's going on in Uncle Sam's mind, but he's clearly not happy about it, right? It's like he's kind of letting it happen, but he's doing so begrudgingly. And then here is a political cartoon showing anti-Filipino immigration. Now, again, you might look at this and say, well, that person looks black. Well, yeah, well, again, same thing with the Irish, right? Black people were depicted in anti-black, literature and cartoons at the time, using these kind of ugly stereotypes and caricatures of what a black person looked like. And other groups, as they come, are often filtered into that same kind of tradition, right? So here we have Filipino men in particular who were coming in large number to work in some of the fruit and vegetable fields in California, were depicted as basically scary tribal black people. And all of these groups, Jews, Italians, Filipino men, Koreans, all get lumped into this kind of second round, I guess, of anti-immigrant legislation. So let's look now at what the Act of 24 actually did. First of all, it banned immigration from all Asian countries. So this is what 1924. So we're going to get to the 60s, but for about 4 decades, there was basically no meaningful immigration from Asian countries. Well, why? Well, because of this act, right? Because of nativism, because Americans didn't want it. And again, this goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Yes, there was dislike of Irish immigrants, who again, we see depicted as monsters, and Chinese immigrants as well. But only the Chinese at that time were explicitly barred from coming to the United States, and that same rhetoric, that same attitude, that same legislation was kind of resurrected as new Asian groups start coming to the United States. After 1924, no more, or at least for now. We'll get to the 60s, that'll change. It also set a low ceiling for immigrants from countries outside of the Western Hemisphere, right? So Western Hemisphere is like Western Europe, right? Countries that we at the time wanted. And basically, it set a higher ceiling for people from more desirable parts of the world and a lower ceiling for people from less desirable parts of the world. And, I keep throwing political cartoons at you, but I feel like they just tell this story better than I could. This is not a dumping ground, signed Uncle Sam, right? And here we see in this image, undesirables, right? Cast-offs, trash. And, maybe thinking, wow, it's really terrible to talk about people that way. But some people talk about immigrants that way today. Why? Well, because we have this long history of talking about immigrants that way. Okay, last point about the 1924 Act. It set quotas for all sending countries at 2% of the current U.S. population for each sending nation. That might be a little confusing, so I'm going to pause here and play a little video that'll just briefly explain it to you.
Some of these earlier restrictive policies in the 1920s and so forth were based on so-called national origins and national origin quotas. And what was done at that point in time was set these quotas on the basis of earlier waves of immigrants. And so that meant that for people who had come from England or Germany, the number who could come in subsequently was set on the relative size of the group that had come before, whereas groups that hadn't come in earlier waves didn't get as many quota slots, so to speak. And so the national origins quota favored earlier kinds of immigrants, earlier origins, countries of origins, and if you like, earlier ethnic group identities, whereas some of the more recently arriving or recently interested migrants coming from newer destinations didn't have as many opportunities to come to the United States, although many from that origin would have wanted to do so.
So to kind of further illustrate what the video was saying, I want to, again, use political cartoons. So here we see Uncle Sam. He's standing at the gate, right, letting people in, but preventing lots of people from not coming in. And basically what the 1924 Act did was, so let's just pick a random country, let's pick France. Say there's like 100,000 French people in the United States at the time. So whatever 2 or 3% of that 100,000 is, that's how many are allowed to come from that country, right? So effectively what this did was that it favored preferred countries that were already overrepresented in the United States, right? Now, the 1924 Act was 2% of whatever the existing population was. You see this political cartoon that says 3%. This political cartoon was actually representing what happened before the act. So basically, before the act, it was 3%. They made it 2%, which doesn't seem that dramatic. But we're talking about thousands and thousands of people here, so it was dramatic. And again, it effectively privileged the countries that Americans at the time thought were already kind of assimilated, right? British and Irish and German, etc. So here's a political cartoon showing kind of another way that America got to decide who came and who didn't, right? Literacy tests. And as you learned from the podcast about Ellis Island, there were all kinds of kind of metrics and mechanisms that the immigration kind of bureaucracy had put in place to decide who came here and who didn't. So yes, a lot of people came to this country. Millions and millions of people came to the United States in the early 20th century. However, that really was probably like a fraction of who wanted to and tried to come here from all over the world. So just to reiterate, this effectively favored immigration from already assimilated nations, specifically England, Germany, and Ireland, and reduced immigration from the undesirable nations noted at the top of this slide. Again, putting undesirable in quotation marks. I'm not saying I think they're undesirable, but at the time, a majority of Americans thought that immigrants from Italy, Eastern Europe, Korea, the Philippines, etc., they didn't want them, right? And the 1924 Act very effectively, reshaped American immigration policy in a way to reflect these ideas of who we want and who we don't want. Now, before getting to our third act, I'm going to take a little break here. Again, I suggest that you take a break as well. And then we'll pick back up with the Immigration Act of 1965, which dramatically changed immigration policy and the demographics of the United States. Okay, I'm calling this last section, the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Browning of America. So basically what I'm going to do two things in this section. One, I'm just going to talk about the Act of 1965, talk about, what it was, what it did, and again, how it significantly reshaped the demographics of the United States of America. In fact, some of you watching this here are probably only watching this because of this act. In particular, if you or your parents are from India or from Africa or from parts of Central and South America, you are again in this country probably because of this act. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of other reasons why you're here, but if you had tried to come to this country 100 years ago, you would not be here, right? And so I think this is a really consequential act. And again, like so many things we talk about in this class, happened because the 60s happened. And I know I'm being a dead horse, but I'll never get tired of saying it. The 1960s was a dramatically consequential era in American history that I think cannot be overstated. And I think even something like immigration demonstrates this. Like so many things that happened in the 60s, the Immigration and Nationality Act, as it's called in its full name, basically has the civil rights movement to thank. Well, why? Well, in 1965, the civil rights movement was really kind of in full swing, right? And Americans were aware of what was happening in the civil rights movement, but the rest of the world was too, right? What was happening in America was making global news. And there was increasing global pressure for the U.S. to basically replace its racist immigration laws, right? Here we are, we have this movement that is trying to dismantle racism and segregation in America, and it just looked very hypocritical for the United States to kind of be moving more and more of a direction of embracing civil rights in terms of legislation and Supreme Court decisions, while maintaining this, just obviously and openly racist immigration policies and practices, right? And here's just some examples of how that played out on the international scene. Here is a piece of, this is really interesting. This is a piece of Russian propaganda from the post-World War II Cold War era. And again, I'm assuming you remember what the Cold War was and what that was all about. And basically this is a piece of Russian propaganda designed for the Russian people. Obviously it's in Russian, right? Not in English. And basically what it's saying is, if you are a Russian person, right, you enjoy freedoms and liberties and a quality of life that even Black people in America don't enjoy, right? Now, whether this is actually true or not is beside the point. What is the point is that American racism and Jim Crow and racial oppression was an international embarrassment. And, again, just a few decades ago, America had fought a war to, liberate Europe from oppression and Nazism and dictatorships. And, here we are basically continuing to oppress and deny Black people their rights. So it was just an embarrassment. So essentially, Congress responded by passing the Immigration Act. President Johnson, who was a very influential liberal progressive president, signed it into law. And here we see him running. Well, why is he floating in the ocean? President Johnson is signing this act at Ellis Island, right? Because again, as you know by now, Ellis Island is a really important kind of symbol in the history of American immigration. And I think this was a very iconic place for him to do that. So what did it do? Well, it did a lot of things, but I think most consequentially, it abolished the national origins quotas of previous acts, right? So no longer can we say, we want a lot of people from this country, but not that many people from this country, or right? So after this act goes into law, no longer could factors like race, religion, and ethnicity be used to prohibit immigration to the US. Which is why when, Trump announced his Muslim ban in the early days of his administration, why the Supreme Court was basically like, nope, you can't do that. Right, that's against the law. Well, what law was it against? Well, against other laws as well, but this is the primary one. Instead, it replaced the quota system with a categorical preference system. So today, people who come to this country legally have to basically kind of demonstrate or prove that like they tick enough boxes, right, on this kind of like, it's almost like a menu of preferable categories. And that to this day is one of the ways that people come to this country legally through our very convoluted immigration system. Now, the legacy of this act cannot be overstated. As we can see here, this basically reopened the gates to Asian people, and people from various Asian countries have come by the millions over the years since this act. People from Latin America as well. African immigration, right, from various African countries, as you can see, really did not start to ramp up until kind of the late 80s, and then other is other. But look at Europe, though. I mean, this is like a nativist worst nightmare, right? The Act of 1965. The vast, overwhelming majority of immigration for pretty much the entire 20th century, and even before then, was from Europe. And now Europe is actually a minority in terms of which parts of the world are sending immigrants to this country. And again, if you or your parents or your family is from some African country, or if you are from India, other countries as well, but I think just in terms of just what I see even at UMBC, right? This act has dramatically changed the demographic makeup of the United States of America. Unsurprisingly, people then and now were and are not happy about this, right? And the data, kind of the opinion polling data, bears that out. So at the time, Americans were split, right? Meaning some people supported it, some people did not. A 1965 Gallup poll, this is right after the act was passed, found that roughly 49% of Americans opposed to the liberalization of immigration laws. Regardless, it significantly increased immigrants from Asia, Africa, and South America. And again, really gave us the America that we have today. So what I want to do in this section before going to talking about the border wall is kind of tease this out a little bit and talk about a dynamic that has been happening for several decades, but I think particularly since the 1990s, called the browning of America. So what does that mean? The browning of America refers to the demographic trend of America becoming less and less white due to immigration and the growth of mixed race families. So again, miscegenation laws, right, repealed in 1967, and since then, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, more and more Americans are, dating and or marrying and or having children with people that are not of their racial category, and that is making America just less white. Now, unsurprisingly, Americans are split over the browning of America. Is this essentially a good thing or essentially a bad thing? Well, Americans are split. Some celebrate this, right? Again, if at the beginning you said that, immigration makes our country stronger and more multicultural, you are probably more likely to be a fan of the browning of America, right? Some celebrate this, thinking that many cultures make America strong. However, some express horror at this. You're like, that's a really strong word, but put this in the larger context of the history of nativism. I think it's an accurate word. Some express horror at this, asserting that America should remain both racially and culturally a majority WASP nation. So based on current immigration and kind of interracial, relationship patterns, this is only going to increase and accelerate, so much so that eventually America is not going to be a majority white nation. So this chart is based on population figures from 2015, right? So, roughly a decade ago. And what we're seeing here is the darker the state gets on the map, the more minorities or the more non-white people are living in that state, right? And this next chart is going to show you a projection for 2030. America is not going to be a majority white country. It's going to be a majority minority country, which is a mouthful, but is pretty accurate. Right, again, unless there's a major change in immigration policy, unless people just stop dating and marrying and having children interracially, this is what's going to happen. And again, this fills a lot of people with fear and concern, particularly if you are an American who believes that, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants founded this country, and which is true, and they should be the ones who continue to control this country, which again is debatable. But this is a super, super, super complex issue that I think I can't do justice. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause here. This video is going to do a fantastic, really, really beautiful job explaining some of the complexities of this issue and how the browning of America is really, really fueling our politics. Check it out.
How a more diverse America makes you feel is the core division in our political and cultural fights right now. But to see why, you need to know how we're changing and how a changing country changes us. Here's the big picture. The US is at a demographic tipping point, a genuinely historic moment. 2013, it was the first year that a majority of US infants under the age of 1 were non-white. By 2016, white deaths had outnumbered white births, but America's overall population, it's not expected to decrease. And that's because the Black, Asian, and especially Latino and mixed-race populations, they're also growing. They're growing fast. By 2045, the Census Bureau projects that non-Hispanic whites will no longer be a majority, and also that foreign-born residents are going to make up a record share of the population. So when you show people these numbers about how America is changing, what goes through their heads? What is their response?
I think people are hearing these changes as somehow a fundamental remaking of what America is. At least a lot of people are hearing it, and some of them are excited about it and some of them are not so excited. We see on average white Americans, when they read about this majority-minority shift, becoming more politically conservative.
Jennifer Richardson is a psychologist who studies how people react to demographic change. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant for this work. And what she's found helps explain a lot of what we're seeing. For instance, when white political independents who live in the West were told that whites were no longer majority in California, they became 11 percentage points more likely to support the Republican Party. That is a huge change. And it's important to say, this is a human reaction to demographic change, not just a white one. When presented with similar data on the growing numbers of Hispanics, Asian Americans shifted towards more conservative views. Black Americans shifted towards more conservative views. Being told your group is shrinking or that it's losing power, it's scary for anyone.
Losing numbers are associated with losing status, losing power, losing currency in the culture.
There are a lot of studies like these, but the one I find myself thinking about the most was done by Harvard's Ryan Enos.
What we did is we sent these 2 Spanish speakers out to catch a train at a certain time every day over a period of days. We'd sent out research assistants and they surveyed these people waiting on the train. And that little exposure was enough to move these attitudes in this survey. They're more likely to say we should send those children of immigrants back to Mexico. They're more likely to say we should decrease immigration from Mexico. And they're even more likely to endorse that English should be the official language of the United States.
We saw a version of this in the election then too, right?
So in states, and even in small areas in states, in these counties, where the Spanish population changed very rapidly, we saw that these voters had moved towards supporting Donald Trump. And a lot of them actually looked like these people that previously had been Democrats.
So here then is what we know. Even gentle, unconscious exposure to reminders that America is diversifying, and particularly to the idea that America is becoming a majority-minority nation, it pushes folks towards more conservative policy opinions, towards more support of the Republican Party. So what happens when those reminders aren't gentle?
Massive demographic changes have been foisted upon the American people. And they're changes that none of us ever voted for and most of us don't like.
Our Christian heritage will be cherished, protected, defended like you've never seen before.
When Obama was elected in 2008, there was all this talk of America moving into a post-racial moment. But the mere existence of Obama's presidency made a lot more of politics about how you felt about race. It had this effect on healthcare, the stimulus package, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party. Hell, it even had this effect on how people felt about Obama's dog.
So the dog is kind of a fun experiment on a serious topic. Both Teddy Kennedy, a well-known liberal Democrat, and Barack Obama have the same dog. Their two dogs are actually related, Portuguese water dogs. So let's see how people respond to these dogs when you tell one that it's Ted Kennedy and one that it is Barack Obama's. What happens is that when you tell people it's Barack Obama's, racial liberals like the dog more, racial conservatives like the dog less. Obama polarizes more because of who he is rather than what he says and does. And so Obama goes through great lengths in both campaigns to try to tamp down racial divisions, to not talk about race. When he does talk about race, he does so in a message of personal responsibility.
And there was something real here. A few decades ago, a multiracial voter base, it couldn't drive American politics like it can now. Obama won in 2012 with only 39% of the white vote. Previous Democratic candidates, they lost elections in big ways with a lot more support by whites. But by 2016, Trump also proved that a candidate who was explicitly talking to white fears about race could win.
The Republicans now have a temptation to explicitly appeal to race. And you're seeing this throughout Republican primaries in the 2018 cycle. And you're seeing it the reverse on the Democratic side. Abolish ICE is a good example. That is a policy that Democrats would not have been on board with in the 1990s, but their bases have moved, and so the incentives have moved as well.
Now, to say American politics is in for turbulence is not to say we're in for dissolution or civil war. California went through these changes. It experienced this demographic shift, and it didn't fall to pieces. But leading up to that, there was a lot of friction. Voters passed racially charged propositions targeting undocumented immigrants. They banned affirmative action. They restricted bilingual education.
But we also know, right, there are states that have large populations of racial minorities, largely Black Americans, but they're growing in Latinos that are incredibly unequal in every way, right? So the question is, we want to think, oh, it'll work out, look at California, but it could also work out and be Mississippi.
As the browning of America continues, this cycle of hope about the future activating fears about the present, it's just going to keep going. In that, politicians who can articulate a vision of this future that is inclusive and inspiring and non-threatening, that very mixture Obama sought in 2008, they could reap massive rewards. But as long as much of the country feels threatened by the changes they see, there's also going to be a continuing, and maybe even a growing, market for politicians like Donald Trump.
Okay, we have one more section. Before we get to that section, I just want to briefly remind us where we've been. So we started out just by talking about immigration. Why does immigration happen? What's some of the vocab around it? And, why is it such a controversial issue in American history and contemporary politics? And then we did kind of an overview of immigration policy and using immigration policy to kind of tell the story of various groups coming to this country, as well as the story of kind of nativism and resentment and hatred towards immigrants, which unfortunately is a very old American thing, which we saw with the Irish and the Chinese. We saw it again with Eastern European Jews, as well as some of the other groups that I briefly mentioned, and how all of those immigration patterns led to kind of further restrictions in the form of the 1924 Immigration Act, but how the 60s happened and reversed that, as the 60s reversed so many trends in America, and how the Immigration Act of 1965 essentially led to the browning of America, which is further fueling our politics in ways that I think are really important to understand. So to end our day, I want to look at a particularly controversial issue, which is the US-Mexico border and undocumented immigration across that border. Now, I'm actually not going to say a lot about it. I'm going to do something a little different for the end. Instead of lecturing about it, I'm basically going to play two videos for you. I'm going to play them in their entirety, and they're going to explain some issues related to the border that I think are really important. One of them is a contemporary issue. The other one is kind of giving you an historical overview of the border. And essentially, as you watch these videos, I'm going to kind of ask you to reflect and come up with some kind of response in reaction to some of the issues and facts and stories told in this video. So the first video came out basically just about a month ago, produced by the Wall Street Journal. It's about something called Title 42. What was Title 42? Why does it no longer exist? And what does that mean for immigration across the US-Mexico border? The second video I'm going to play is called How Walls Ended Up Along the US-Mexico Border. It might surprise people to realize that for most of our history with Mexico, we did not have a border wall. Now we do. It's not complete. It's not clear if it's going to be complete because of the changing nature of partisan politics in the United States. But again, regardless of your opinion of the border, of the wall, of whatever, I think it's always instructive and helpful and important to just understand that there's always a history behind everything, right? And this video, and I think, again, you know, if you're more conservative, you might be like, New York Times. But again, I think this video does a good job of just explain to you, like, here's how the wall happened. Here's why we didn't have one. Here's why we have one now. As you're watching these two videos, I want you to be kind of in your mind working on a prompt and a response. So I'm going to give you two prompts. Choose one. As you're watching the video, the two videos, come up with a response to that prompt and then post a reflection to Lino. Again, as usual, make sure you sign your name so I know who did it so you get credit for it. Prompt number one is this. How does the historical information and overview of the second video shed light on the issue explored in the first video? Right? Again, this question will make sense as you watch the videos. So the first video is a contemporary issue. The second video is kind of a historical overview. What happens if you put these two videos in conversation? How can they shed light on each other? Second question is this. Imagine that you are working in the Biden administration to address issues at the border. How would understanding the history of the border shape your policy proposals, right? So in other words, there are lots of opinions out there about how to solve the border, right? Liberals have ideas, conservative has ideas, independents have ideas. Oftentimes, a lot of the ideas people come up with, regardless of your political persuasion, are not informed by history, which bothers me. So, how would understanding the history of the border, particularly in the second video, help shape your policy proposals about how to address and handle issues at the border? Again, pick one, watch the two videos. As you're watching the two videos, note some things that you think are important. And then at the end, just craft a response and put it up on the Lino board. Make sure to post it with your name. I look forward to reading your thoughts as usual. And we'll be back for our final class talking about poverty in the United States. Thank you.
Title 42, the pandemic-era policy that allowed U.S. authorities to quickly expel migrants on public health grounds, has expired. The Biden administration has deployed 1,500 active-duty troops at the southern border to assist the Border Patrol with processing as fears of a significant surge of migrants grow. Wall Street Journal's Alicia A. Caldwell reports from El Paso, Texas, and explains what Title 42 is, the effect it has had on the border, and what comes next.
Title 42 is a public health law that was used by the Trump administration to quickly remove or expel migrants who cross the border illegally intending to ask for asylum.
The policy's name comes from Title 42 of the U.S. Legal Code, which is a body of public health laws. The Trump administration began using it in March 2020 to turn back migrants on grounds that they might bring COVID-19 into the U.S. Under the policy, most migrants were sent back to Mexico after Border Patrol agents recorded their names and fingerprints.
Border Patrol and the U.S. government has been quick to point out it was not an immigration law, so it carried with it no immigration penalties.
The measure proved to be far from an ideal enforcement tool. It had the unexpected result of making it easier for non-asylum migrants to attempt repeated border crossings.
So if you got caught, got returned, you lived to see another day in terms of your immigration opportunity or chance to cross the border illegally again and make it through.
Authorities had already recorded big increases in illegal crossings leading up to Title 42's expiration. In March, cities like El Paso experienced a 54% increase in Border Patrol encounters compared to the same period last year. Looking at the southwest border overall, total encounters increased 25% in the same period. The change in border policy has also created confusion among migrants.
There's tremendous disinformation, and smugglers have an interest in pushing people across the border now.
I want to be very clear. Our borders are not open. People who cross our border unlawfully and without a legal basis to remain will be promptly processed and removed.
The governors of Arizona and Texas have said that the Biden administration's policies inadequately secure the border, leaving them to bear the brunt of the migrant waves.
President Biden is laying down a welcome mat to people across the entire world, saying that the United States border is wide open and it would lead to an incredible amount of people coming across the border illegally.
The Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, said the administration is employing a combination of existing immigration laws and a new set of measures to address the migrant surge.
People who arrive at our southern border will be subject to our immigration enforcement authorities under Title VIII of the United States Code.
Title VIII is an immigration law and does carry penalties. It is technically a misdemeanor to cross the border without permission, and those who do and are returned face a 5-year ban from returning to the country legally. And if they do return and they get caught, they can face a felony charge for crossing the border again.
The Biden administration's new set of measures is intended to mimic the Title 42 border policy. Migrants who enter the U.S. illegally, which asylum seekers are allowed to do under current law, will be quickly subjected to a higher asylum standard.
Those who cross illegally and haven't asked for protections in other countries prior to their arrival here, by and large, won't be eligible. They'll face swift deportation.
And they will be deported back to their home countries or back to Mexico, which has agreed to keep taking them. The administration also plans to open new migrant processing centers in Guatemala and Colombia to create some legal pathways for asylum seekers. Yet it's unclear when the centers would open or how much impact they will have.
They're also pushing people to use the CBP One app. It's an app that you can make an appointment to come to a legal border crossing, a port of entry, and make your case to enter the United States.
Asylum seekers at the border will be essentially barred from entering the country under the rules, unless they use the app's appointment system.
Ahorita como la aplicación CBP One tiene muchísimos problemas, está marcando error, no está marcando citas, en la hora se queda trabada, y hay muchísimos errores en esa aplicación.
So you have a real mix of people who are trying to use this app, some with some success and others saying that they just can't wait any longer and making the trek. The expectation is that a lot of people will simply make the effort to cross and see what happens.
Ya buscar un bienestar para los niños.
¿Ustedes trataron de entrar por la aplicación CBP One?
Sí, pero ha demorado mucho el proceso. Está congestionada la aplicación, no suelta muchas citas así.
¿Y decidieron entregarse?
Sí.
¿Qué es lo que esperan?
¿Poder pasar?
This is what part of the U.S. and Mexico border looked like in 1898. Just an open strip of land with train tracks going across. Here's what that same stretch looked like 110 years later, in 2008. The open land is split by a fence. A border gate replaces the train tracks. So how do we get here? From open desert to a patchwork of highly politicized border barriers. To understand, we're going to focus mostly on a single location, in Nogales, the spot where this stone monument marks the borderline. What happens here tells the story of the border's transformation, the how and the why. We'll begin in 1848. The United States has just defeated Mexico in a war over expansion. Mexico is forced to sign away more than half its land and sell a bit more later on. This is how the U.S. got the land which includes today's border. But there's no fences or barriers yet. No, first the border just gets marked, in many places with nothing more than a pile of stones. These stones are at the spot I mentioned that we're going to focus on, outside a saloon in Nogales. The saloon is on the U.S. side. There's essentially free movement back and forth. But these rocks hardly mark the border accurately. The border stays like this for 43 years, until 1891. That's when the US and Mexico set out to define the border with better accuracy. Stone monuments go up at regular intervals to clearly mark it. If we go back to the saloon, Monument 122 stands where the pile of rocks once was. The monument will remain, but the saloon will be torn down. Why? In 1897, the president orders that several buildings be demolished in order to clear a 60-foot wide path along the border. Mexico has already done this. The path is cleared to make smuggling easier to spot. Not drug smuggling. This is smuggling of everyday goods to avoid import and export taxes. The new tract of open land also emphasizes the growing separation between Mexico and the U.S. Still, there's no border fence in Nogales, not yet. But in rural areas, there's a problem only a border fence can solve. Ticks. In the early 1900s, ticks are causing disease among cows in rural areas. Those cows are crossing back and forth over the border. So the first ever border fence is actually built to keep cows from spreading disease. But what about the first fence meant to control human movement? There are three big reasons the U.S. invests in more security at the southern border, culminating in the first permanent fence. Number one, racist attitudes towards Chinese people had led to law banning their immigration to the U.S. The law was enforced mainly at water ports, but less so on the Mexican border. So going through Mexico became an easier way Chinese people could avoid the ban and still enter the U.S. But the large number of people showing up along the southern border eventually drew stricter security. Then in 1910, a revolution breaks out in Mexico. That leads to reason number two for a security buildup. The U.S. sends troops to the border to stop the fighting from spilling over. Here's that monument I showed you earlier, where the saloon once was. This time in 1913. Then, World War I. Reason number three for the security buildup. U.S. troops stay on the border. There's paranoia in America that German spies might cross over from the Mexican side. All this violence and intrigue creates a tense atmosphere on the border. Small gun battles erupt between jittery American and Mexican forces. Each side blames the other. So here's where the first permanent border fence to manage human crossings comes to be, in 1918. It's made of wire, very basic. You could easily climb over the fence if you wanted to. But its purpose isn't to wall off the two countries. The fence is a way to diffuse the tension and control the flow of growing border traffic. Then, prohibition happens. Alcohol is legal in Mexico, so yeah, a lot of American visitors go there. The U.S. monitors crossings to enforce the regulation of American morality, as one researcher puts it. Also, population along the border is growing, so we see the border fence get enhancements in the late 1920s. It's got barbed wire at the top. Lampposts are installed. New stone pillars form crossing gates. Prohibition gives way to the Depression, and then World War II. Here's where the U.S. starts to use barriers to really keep people out. A program is bringing Mexican workers into the U.S. to beef up the wartime labor force.
The term most commonly used is braceros.
But at the same time, other Mexicans without authorization to enter the U.S. sneak across the border anyway, looking for jobs. This photo shows the U.S. border agent demonstrating how easy people can get through a rural border fence. So all this leads to more fences and more border patrols. The racial slur in this newsreel title shows the prejudice towards Mexican workers during this time. The U.S. places more restrictions on Mexican immigration in the following decades. That begins a cycle that continues to this day. Less ways to legally enter the U.S. means more people crossing the border illegally, which leads to more deportations. To build stronger border barriers, the U.S. uses surplus from the Vietnam War. See right here? It's a helicopter landing mat. Mats like these line the border in the 1990s. Meanwhile, the U.S. is increasing roundups of undocumented immigrants.
There is too much of it, and we must do much more to stop it.
Then we come to September 11th. That brings strong bipartisan support for more border security.
This bill will make our borders more secure.
And the length of the border wall expands to 5 times what it was, even though the number of illegal crossings are going down.
We have more of everything. ICE, Border Patrol, surveillance, you name it.
Border security remains a huge rallying cry.
You gotta have a wall. If you don't have a wall, it's never gonna end.
A wall is an immorality. It's not who we are as a nation.
And so the debate continues. That's how we got here. Barriers have existed along the border for a long time, but their purpose has been ever-changing.